If you Google Star Wars alien designs, this image will probably pop up somewhere in the results. It first started floating around online after the release of The Last Jedi, and it's designed to show off the diversity and creativity of the creature design from the George Lucas era of Star Wars, contrasted against the squudgy brown lumps that seem to appear so often in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. And while it's probably unfair to compare the creature design of two movies against the entire 6-film saga that came before, this picture wouldn't be posted and reposted years later if there wasn't an overall sentiment that the creature design of this new era of Star Wars didn't live up to its predecessors. So let's find out why. Let's take a look at the design process for each of these aliens and see if we can figure out why each group of creatures looks the way it does, what's elevating the good designs, and what might be holding back the bad ones. The first aliens we're introduced to in the Star Wars universe are the Jawas. They first appear in A New Hope's second draft script, where they're described as wearing grubby cloaks and their faces are shrouded so that only their yellow eyes can be seen, which is basically what ended up on screen. The Jawas are also described in ambiguously human terms, being referred to as men or dwarfs, with the word Jawa implied to be a nickname. The sketches by costume designer John Mollo would make them slightly more alien, with scrunchy, inhuman faces barely visible in the shadows of their hoods. In the final film, their faces were completely blacked out, leaving them mysterious. The script constantly mentions how revolting they are, and not showing them allows the audience to imagine the most disgusting thing they can think of, rather than just the most disgusting thing the artists working on the movie could think of. Also living on Tatooine are the Tusken Raiders, who were designed by legendary concept artist Ralph McQuarrie. McQuarrie thought that due to living in a desert environment with constant sandstorms, the Tuskens would need help to see and breathe, so he gave them goggles and breath masks that were translated fairly faithfully onto the screen. But the idea of cloaked, masked warriors who ambush the protagonist in the desert actually predates the Sand People as a concept. The movie's rough draft script has a scene near the beginning of the story that's nearly identical to the encounter we see on screen, but instead of Luke Skywalker being ambushed by Sand People, Deke Starkiller is caught off guard and killed by a masked Sith Knight, an idea that would eventually evolve into Darth Vader. And this focus on masks and cloaks for the Sand People and the Jawas means that the movie gets to show us aliens without actually showing us aliens. For all we know, they could be human under there, which makes it more impactful when we get to the Mos Eisley Cantina and start seeing the really weird stuff. Unfortunately, when they filmed it, it wasn't nearly weird enough. See, the sequence was pulled up in the shooting schedule by a week, and creature sculptor Stuart Freeborn fell ill at around the same time, so there weren't nearly as many strange aliens available for the scene as George Lucas would have liked. So after returning home and assembling a rough cut, Lucas decided that they needed to do reshoots in order to add more creatures, and he managed to negotiate an extra $20,000 for the sequence from the studio, which would be about $100,000 today. And this scene was a big deal for Lucas. Although the movie is chock full of iconic imagery, the cantina sequence is one of the earliest and most persistent ideas he had for the film. In May 1973, 4 years before the movie was released, George Lucas wrote a 2,000-word outline of his story. In this version, Luke Skywalker is a 60-year-old general, R2 and 3PO are human bureaucrats, the rebels are nothing more than a gang of teenage boys, and the movie ends with an unnamed princess being rescued from the Empire's floating city fortress while the Death Star remains intact. But even with all these differences, the cantina scene is there, complete with an alien creature being cut down by a Jedi after hassling his young companion. So in order to make the sequence as impactful to the audience as it must have been in Lucas's imagination, he hired a makeup artist who was the friend of one of the special effects guys to help and add to the film's alien roster. Luckily for Lucas, that makeup artist turned out to be Rick Baker, who would go on to win 7 Academy Awards for his work. So it might not come as a surprise that Baker, alongside a small crew of other artists, would go on to create most of the cantina aliens people actually remember, including the very first one. Jump scaring the audience as they enter the cantina is a creature called T-Head, who would later be given the proper name Hem-Dazon. Since T-Head was only designed to be in one shot, a full body was never created for him, but his limited design definitely served the purpose of that one shot. He's only on screen for a second, but the strong silhouette of his head and his golden eyes glittering in the dark are immediately identifiable, and a great way to bring the audience into this wretched hive of scum and villainy. And if you look carefully, you can even see the flashlight they stuck in the back of his skull to make his eyes glow. Another late addition to the cantina scene are the aliens that would come to be known as Duros, designed by artist Ron Cobb. These guys were created to resemble the popular image of alien greys, and are seemingly supposed to be pretty mysterious, even in a world as weird as Star Wars. For other creatures he created, Cobb came up with things like their habitat and behavior to help inform and justify the design, but for the Duros, the only note he left is a faint "nothing known" on the side of the page. Not all of the new Cantina aliens would be as fleshed out as Cobb's creations, though. Because so many creatures were needed for the reshoots, Rick Baker donated some masks he had lying around to help supplement the ones made specifically for the movie. Among them was a devil character that Baker had initially made for a movie that John Landis was pitching in the early 1970s. The mask would eventually show up on screen, worn by Baker in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Another of Baker's creations are the Cantina's live band, which Star Wars lore says are a quintet of Bith Jizzwailers called Figrin Dan and the Modal Nodes, and who, according to George Lucas, dug up some old Benny Goodman records and tried to replicate the music they found on them. This supposed interaction with Earth might be the reason for the Bith's own resemblance to the Greys. And since these aliens were intended to be musicians, early sculpts for the mask even gave them second mouths on their necks to help them wail their jizz. But even among all these strange creatures, they're not exactly characters. For that, we have to go to Chewbacca the Wookiee. The term Wookiee actually predates Star Wars, being mentioned in George Lucas's first movie, THX 1138. And the intergalactic version of the creature is pretty old as well. In the movie's rough draft, the heroes find themselves marooned on a dense jungle planet and kidnapped by a society of primitive alien warriors called Wookiees, who eventually aid the heroes by stealing a squadron of Imperial starships and blowing up the Death Star. This idea of a technologically inferior group of people not only standing up to but defeating an advanced military force appealed to Lucas, who had some strong thoughts about the Vietnam War and was even supposed to direct Apocalypse Now before he became too busy with Star Wars. When the full Wookiee tribe was phased out of the script, Lucas decided to keep at least one around as a character, specifically as Han Solo's co-pilot. A decision inspired by his wife's dog, a large Alaskan Malamute, who would join Lucas on drives and sit in the front passenger seat of the car. And that dog actually ended up influencing another famous movie character down the road, because the dog's name was Indiana.
You are named after the dog?
The first description of Chewie in the second draft script was as an 8-foot-tall, savage-looking creature resembling a huge gray bush baby monkey with fierce baboon-like fangs. And Ralph McQuarrie's concept art followed this description pretty closely. That is, until George Lucas came across a short story by George R.R. Martin in a science fiction magazine in 1975. This story featured a group of furry, forest-dwelling creatures called Janshi, and Lucas gave the magazine's illustrations of the creatures to McQuarrie to serve as the new direction to take Chewie's design. That design would then be further refined by Stuart Freeborn, who adapted it into a wearable costume that would fit the lanky frame of actor Peter Mayhew. Another alien that's an actual character in the movie is Greedo. And unlike most of the other famous Cantina aliens we've talked about, Greedo was among the creatures that was actually completed on time for the initial filming of the sequence, maybe partially because his rubber face was built onto a pre-existing Peapod alien mask that Stuart Freeborn had created for a commercial. When he first appears in the script, Greedo is described as a slimy, purple-faced alien with a short trunk nose. The concept art by costume designer John Mallow certainly includes the trunk nose, but he ended up green in the movie rather than purple. And instead of the alien tracksuit look he sported on screen, the illustration shows him wearing a flight suit, similar to the one Luke and the other rebels wear later in the movie. Though, in the end, he kinda did wear a rebel flight suit, since the style of English racing jacket that Greedo wears on screen would later be used as part of the snowspeeder pilot outfits in The Empire Strikes Back. That same type of jacket would also show up a couple more times in A New Hope, being worn by both the Walrus Man Ponda Bamba in the cantina and Luke himself at the end of the movie. Once we leave the cantina, we're introduced to the last new alien creature of the movie, Garindan, the Kubaz spy. In the script, Garindan is only described as a darkly clad creature, and only appears in the fourth draft, which was written after the movie was cast and after most of the concept art for the major characters was already done. Since the character was pretty minor and added fairly late in the process, his look likely would have been created by costume designer John Mallow on the fly. The creature's look may have also influenced its sound. With its mask suggesting an insect-like proboscis, it would make sense to give it a buzzing voice to match. A voice that was actually made up of heavily processed clips of John Wayne. With the cantina behind us, the rest of the movie is dominated by human characters, so let's move on to The Empire Strikes Back, where we're quickly introduced to the Wampa ice monster on Hoth. The design of this creature is pretty straightforward, being essentially a Yeti with goat horns, but its final look actually had about 15 years to be refined. Inspired by 1951's The Thing from Another World, George Lucas initially wanted the first act of his Star Wars sequel to feature the rebels being driven from their Arctic base by attacks from terrifying alien creatures. This sequence would also feature Luke getting attacked by the monsters, providing an in-universe reason for his face to look different after Mark Hamill's real-life car accident and subsequent reconstructive surgery in 1977. So while the story would eventually change to feature the Empire as the reason for the Rebels' evacuation of Hoth, the monsters weren't removed from the script entirely. The attack on Luke still needed to happen, and a few scenes featuring captive Wampas being unleashed on the Imperial invaders were even filmed, though ultimately deleted. This might have been at least partially because, since the creatures were performed by guys in suits walking on stilts, they looked pretty goofy. When George Lucas began work on the Star Wars Special Edition in the 90s, he had a chance to go back and revisit the Wampa to make it actually seem intimidating. So rather than the goofy stilt suits from the original version of the movie, the Special Edition featured a suit that was correctly sized for the performer inside, filmed on a small-scale ice cave set that would make the creature seem larger than it really was. Another monstrous new creature in The Empire Strikes Back is the Trandoshan bounty hunter Bossk. Though rather than starting out as a reptilian creature, the script described him as a slimy, tentacled monster with two huge bloodshot eyes and a soft, baggy face. That idea didn't make it into the movie, and the Bossk we got was recycled from Cantina leftovers. His head was repainted from one of Stuart Freeborn's alien masks, and his outfit was taken from a background performer who was wearing an old British Air Force pressure suit. Some of the other bounty hunters were cobbled together in similar ways. Boba Fett's armor was originally designed for a new type of stormtrooper, but the suit prototype ended up being too expensive to make multiple copies of, so it became a bounty hunter's battle armor instead. Dengar also wears repainted Imperial gear, though his is cobbled together from stormtrooper and snowtrooper armor rather than being a new design. The droids were largely reused as well. IG-88 is partially made out of old Cantina props, and Forlom is a modified protocol droid. Ironically, Zuckuss, or Tuckus in the script, was actually described as being human, so it is a bit odd that he became more complex when he hit the screen. But concept art for the bounty hunters, which uses Bossk's large-eyed design brief as a jumping-off point, seems to point to an evolution that ultimately resulted in an insectoid Zuckuss, with Bossk himself becoming a cheaper creation. But like the Cantina denizens, none of the new mercenary aliens in the movie are really characters, so let's move on and take a look at the movie's biggest and smallest new character, Yoda. With Ben Kenobi being killed off in the first movie, Luke needed a new Jedi teacher for the sequel. George Lucas wanted Luke's new teacher to be, like Obi-Wan, a strange hermit character, but he wanted to take that idea further since Alec Guinness had brought a lot of unexpected nobility to his portrayal of Kenobi. To help with this, Lucas thought of the idea of making the new character an alien creature, potentially a puppet, which would also give him an excuse to work with Jim Henson and the other Muppeteers who had expressed interest in doing a project together. Some of the early designs by artist Joe Johnston took Yoda in a more whimsical direction, though eventually the withered frog-like character Lucas was envisioning started to take shape with the help of Ralph McQuarrie. And once the design got into the hands of Stuart Freeborn, the sculpting process gave the character a lot more personality, with Freeborn basing the wrinkles around Yoda's eyes on those of Albert Einstein and even exaggerating some elements of his own face to give Yoda a slightly comical appearance. Moving on from The Last of the Jedi to The Return of the Jedi, we have probably the best movie in the trilogy when it comes to new aliens. Mostly because a lot of those new aliens are actually characters this time around rather than just being background detail. The first one we meet is Bib Fortuna, whose species, the Twi'leks, would go on to become an iconic presence in the Star Wars universe. The Twi'leks are also unique in that they're the first alien race in the trilogy to introduce sexual dimorphism, though that may be due to them not actually starting out as the same species. Bib was described in early versions of the script as a wizened old man in a tall hat, and his female counterpart Ula was merely a generic alien dancer. Ralph McQuarrie created some initial, more human versions of Fortuna, with artist Nilo Rodis Jamero picking up the character later and taking him further into the realm of the alien. Finally, creature designer Phil Tippett would create the final look, complete with head tentacles and a cranium enlarged with pulsating bumps. As Jabba's major domo, the filmmakers wanted the character to be tall and disgusting, but the opposite would have to be true for Ula. Early illustrations by Nilo Rodis Jamero depicted her with an elongated skull as her sole alien feature, but eventually she would be given head tentacles by Phil Tippett as well. The Gamorrean guards are also introduced alongside Bib, and they actually started out as something resembling generically reptilian gorillas in early drawings by Ralph McQuarrie. When Joe Johnston did his versions of the creatures, they began to adopt more pig-like features, but it was actually creature shop sculptor Dave Carson who came up with the final design. Next, from Jabba's guards, we can go to Jabba himself. Jabba the Hutt is a character who's changed quite a bit since he was first created. First appearing in the second draft of A New Hope, back then he was just one of several pirates who served aboard the Millennium Falcon under its captain Oxus. In the third draft, he was the captain himself, with Han being a cabin boy who has to steal the ship in order to take the job from Luke and Obi-Wan. In the fourth draft, Han owns the Falcon outright, and Jabba became the crime lord we know today. More or less. None of the early drafts even suggest that Jabba isn't a human being. And only one version of the script, published in 1979, 2 years after the movie's release, amends its description of Jabba to say that he is a fat, slug-like creature with eyes on extended feelers and a huge, ugly mouth. And famously, the version of Jabba's scene that exists in the movie today was originally filmed with human actor Declan Mulholland in full Star Wars costume. George Lucas has claimed that Mulholland's performance was always intended to be temporary and that he wanted to superimpose a different creature in post-production until it was decided to be too expensive, but I think he was just being polite. The scene with Jabba had to be reshot twice after the initial filming day because Lucas wasn't satisfied with Mulholland's performance, which is something that wouldn't happen if you were intending to replace the actor entirely anyway. But regardless of the reason, after the movie was released, Lucas had the opportunity to think about what Jabba would look like the next time he showed up. Star Wars was a big enough hit that sequels were inevitable, and Han's debt to the crime lord would have to be dealt with. So when the Hutt finally showed up in Return of the Jedi, his appearance more or less aligned with what was in that 1979 version of the Star Wars script, minus the eyes on extended feelers. This version of Jabba was inspired by characters played by actor Sidney Greenstreet, whose imposing presence also influenced the Marvel Comics character Kingpin. As a counterpoint to Jabba's immense size, we have Salacious B. Crumb, a creature who started out as a joke suggestion from sound designer Ben Burt. He thought it would be funny if, as part of the goings-on at Jabba's palace, there would be a little alien hype man who sat on the shoulder of a larger friend and repeated everything the big guy said during an argument. So a puppet was built based on this idea. Originally, he was supposed to be paired with a creature known as Effant Mon, but the crew found him to be so amusing that he was promoted to Jabba's sidekick and given a larger role in the movie. As for the character's unlikely name, that actually came from the creature shop going out for a drunken lunch after being asked by George Lucas to come up with something appropriate for their new creation. When future dinosaur wrangler Phil Tippett slurred that he needed to tie his shoelaces, the character's name started to take shape. Lucas would later give him the last name Crumb, in honor of Horny on Main underground comics artist Robert Crumb. On the opposite end of the scale from Salacious is the Rancor. The only story requirement for the creature was that it would be able to grab Luke with its hands and try and eat him, which gave the artist a lot of freedom when coming up with its design. But there was also a practical element to consider. How would the monster be brought to life on screen? Early on, it was thought that the creature might be a performer in a suit like Godzilla, so early designs had more humanoid proportions. But when that didn't end up working and the creature became a puppet instead, its form was exaggerated with longer arms, shorter legs, and an overall look that its creators described as a cross between a bear and a potato. And despite the Rancor's tragic fate in the movie, the show must go on. And who better to perform than Max Rebo and his band? Max is one of the most misunderstood aliens in Star Wars. The little blue elephant guy was designed as a musician who would play a strange circular organ instrument, but what made his design unique was that he didn't use his hands to play. Instead, he used his feet. When the initial maquette was translated to a performer's costume, a lot of that design intent was lost. And like Max Rebo, the three-eyed goat-like alien Reese was one of those characters that was designed via a sculpted maquette rather than a two-dimensional illustration. In this case, the maquette was created by Chris Wallace, who was also working on 2 other movies at ILM at the time. When he was brought in to work on Star Wars, Chris, like the other creature sculptors, was told just to make as many different aliens as he could to help fill out the movie's repertoire, with the expectation that most of them wouldn't be approved. As it turned out, Lucas liked all the creatures Wallace presented in that first batch, including Reese, who was designed as an homage to the outlandish aliens seen in various 60s sci-fi TV shows made by Irwin Allen. After the destruction of Jabba's sail barge, the next new creatures we're introduced to in the movie are the non-human members of the Rebel Alliance. The first one to get a speaking role is Admiral Akbar. In the revised rough draft of the script, Admiral Akbar is described as a pale blue non-human creature who speaks an alien language, but his actual appearance was left up to director Richard Marquand. Although many of the movie's creatures were approved by George Lucas, Lucas wanted Marquand to pick the design used for Akbar from among the various aliens being created for the movie. Marquand chose an illustration by Anilo Rodas Jamero of a bulbous fish-headed creature because he wanted kids watching the movie to understand that good people weren't always good-looking, and ugly people weren't automatically evil, and some of them are excellent singers.
Enough of this serious talk. I'd like to regale you now with, "Oh, I'm ugly as sin, 'cause beautiful's out ugly's in. If you're ugly like me, you're in good company. 'cause there's millions of us who are ugly.
The other featured new member of the Alliance is Nien Nunb, a Sullustan, who serves as Lando's co-pilot during the Battle of Endor. Like many other aliens in the movie, Nien started out as just another random maquette, this one sculpted by Dave Carson, and was only later selected for a more prominent role. According to Carson, the design evolved as he was making it, with the focal point of the character being a pair of nostrils that continued out along the face to become jowls. So, while his design didn't come from any specific character requirements, the focus on giving him a couple of prominent, easy-to-recognize characteristics probably helped him to stand out in a way that a more generic design wouldn't. From the space above Endor, we can go to the forest itself and take a look at the last major species to be introduced in the Star Wars trilogy, the Ewoks. Despite their late arrival, their role in the story dates all the way back to the rough draft of A New Hope, in which you'll remember George Lucas wanted the primitive Wookiees to help the heroes save the day. When the Wookiees evolved into the scrappy Rebel Alliance, Lucas held on to his furry warrior idea and reused it in Return of the Jedi. Only, he ran into a couple of problems. The first was that Chewbacca had already demonstrated that Wookiees were technologically capable, something that ran counter to his desire to feature a primitive species overcoming the Empire. The second problem was casting. The first movie had a hard enough time just finding Peter Mayhew, and it would be that much more difficult to fill out an entire tribe of 7-foot-tall Wookiees in the days before you could just digitally replicate a handful of basketball players. So Lucas cut the Wookiees in half, shortening the name to Ewok and shortening their stature along with it, making them more similar to the Jawas and Ugnaughts that had filled out the other movies. Ralph McQuarrie was the first artist to take a crack at designing the Ewoks, and Neil Rodas Jamero and Joe Johnston came in later to refine them and flesh them out once George Lucas approved a design direction that would give them pug noses and large, intelligent eyes. And for a while, that was it. New aliens would show up in books and cartoons over the years, and a couple of creatures would get makeovers for the special editions, but the Star Wars menagerie wouldn't expand in a really meaningful way until 1999's The Phantom Menace, and that movie didn't waste any time doing so. Right away, we're introduced to Newt Gunray of the Nemoidians. These guys are essentially robber barons, hyper-capitalist ghouls that are named after Republicans and act as the primary villains of the movie. Initially, the Nemoidians were supposed to be CGI characters like the battle droids, with emaciated limbs and elongated faces that would suggest that the droids were built in the image of their masters. Ironically, in real life, the droids were created first, and the early Nemoidians were designed to match. But adding so many extra digital characters to the movie would have been pretty expensive, so the idea was scrapped, and a new design was quickly put together based on the Duro seen in the cantina in A New Hope, with enough differences to make them a new species to avoid stepping on the toes of established lore. Let's move on to the second new species introduced in the movie, the Gungans. Jar Jar Binks was designed to be a slapstick performer in the vein of Buster Keaton or Disney's Goofy. His long ears and gangly limbs lend themselves to physical comedy, and his stalk eyes give him the ability to pull off exaggerated, cartoony expressions without breaking physical plausibility too much. Artist Terrell Whitlatch started out with a Turgle-like creature and began slowly playing around with different combinations of features until reaching his final design. All these early versions of Gungans do have one thing in common though: they're amphibious, which likely comes from two places. The first is an early idea that George Lucas had to include a water planet in The Empire Strikes Back, which would allow the movie to feature an underwater city. That underwater city eventually found a place in The Phantom Menace, necessitating underwater inhabitants. The other big influence on the Gungans, and the prequels in general, is Jurassic Park. After seeing the work ILM had done on that movie, George Lucas decided that its digital dinosaurs meant that he could finally indulge all the ideas he'd had to abandon on the original Star Wars movies because they would have been too expensive or outright impossible to do. But despite CGI becoming such a powerful tool, it still had limitations, particularly when it came to simulating things like hair. So digital Wookiees were off the table, but smooth-skinned amphibious Gungans were more plausible. The movie then takes us from lush Naboo to arid Tatooine, where we meet the Toydarian junk dealer Watto. Like the Gungans, Watto is a CGI character, which means he's mostly hairless, save for some short, scruffy stubble, and his face is based on an early illustration for the Nemoidians by design director Doug Chiang. As for Watto's body, that was more challenging. After deciding on Watto's face, George Lucas asked the art department to put it on a creature with a fat body, duck feet, and bat wings. After some more physically plausible designs were rejected, Doug Chiang did a version that interpreted the brief as literally as possible, and it turned out to be exactly what Lucas was looking for. At first, the animation team was apprehensive about the approved design and were concerned that the size of Watto's wings would make his ability to fly seem implausible, but they ended up justifying it by treating his belly as being full of helium, meaning that his wings would just need to help him steer rather than needing to provide lift on their own. And once we've met Watto, that takes us to this movie's version of the cantina scene or Jabba's palace with the pod race, and its bizarre assortment of alien racers. And because they're mostly CG characters, they will, of course, be bald. The first racer we meet is an especially dangerous Dug named Sebulba. This camel-faced bully was a Terrell Whitlatch design, and he didn't go through very many revisions since Lucas liked his spider-like feel and that he walked on his hands and drove with his feet. Sebulba, and most of the other pod racers like Rats Terrell and Ben Quadraneros, were also designed with specific features that would be beneficial when racing pods. Sometimes this manifested as bizarre or extrasensory organs or additional limbs, and in many cases, a small stature similar to real-life jockeys who benefit from not adding too much extra weight to their mounts. Foden Bede, the two-headed pod race announcer designed by Terrell Whitlatch, was originally intended to be a mixture of live action and animation, with the actors' heads placed on a double-necked digital alien body. After the pod race, the movie's heroes have their first major encounter with Darth Maul, whose design didn't actually start out as a Sith Lord. When designing the character, George Lucas kicked off the art department by just telling them to draw their worst nightmares, hoping that one of their illustrations would be enough to serve as a jumping-off point. And while there were some designs that got used elsewhere, none of them actually became Maul himself. For that, artist Ian McCaig actually refined a design that started out as a Republic senator, a bald human with a pattern of circuit board tattoos. And Maul might have stayed human too, if not for a crown of feathers wrapped around his head that eventually became horns, cementing him as a member of the new Zabrak species. After the encounter with Maul, the next batch of aliens we see are on Coruscant, most prominently in the Jedi Council. When trying to come up with new Jedi designs, the art department looked to a variety of sources. Benton Ju created Opa Rensis based on an illustration from a Chinese calendar he saw at his parents' house, and Ian McCaig created Eth Koth by doing an alien caricature of Doug Chang. The origins of other Jedi aren't as clear though. While we know that Saesee Tiin is a toned-down version of a much more fearsome piece of concept art, Plo Koon doesn't seem to have any early designs published at all. We do know, however, that Ian McCaig, in addition to doing caricatures of other art department members, used Ben Kenobi as inspiration when coming up with new Jedi. Ki-Adi-Mundi, for example, came from McCaig crossing old Obi-Wan with a whale, and it's possible that Plo Koon might have come from a similar place, maybe imagining a version of Ben Kenobi who had to wear a Vader-like breathing apparatus. Another character without a clear design history is Vice Chancellor Mas Amedda. Like with the Jedi, the art department was tasked with coming up with a bunch of designs for potential Republic senators, and it's likely that Amedda came from this pool of illustrations. Moving on to Attack of the Clones, one of the first new aliens we're introduced to in this movie is the Nautolan Kit Fisto. Like a lot of the new Jedi in this movie, Kit originates as an early design for the character that would become Count Dooku. Like he did on Episode 1, George Lucas let the art department run wild in coming up with potential designs for the movie's new Sith villain. And while the character ended up being based on an illustration for a Coruscant policeman, the team's Sith work didn't go to waste, with many of the striking villain designs from artist Dermot Power being reused for new Jedi, Kit Fisto among them. The other new Jedi introduced in that scene with Kit are the Miri Allens Luminara Unduli and Barriss Offee, who also came from Dermot Power's potential Sith designs. The art department spent a lot of time on this movie trying to convince Lucas to add a female character to the series villain roster, and while Darth Tyrannus ended up male, they still kinda succeeded. The character design that evolved into Barriss Offee was also used as the basis for the Clone Wars character Asajj Ventress, and the team's suggestion for a female villain may also have helped to inspire the Claudette bounty hunter Zam Wesell, whose costume actually comes from an early design for a clone trooper uniform. A potential female Sith Lord was also used as the basis for the Togruta Jedi Shaak Ti, a character that acts as a sort of digital band-aid for the movie. Attack of the Clones only has one brief scene in the Jedi Council chamber, so rather than spending money to rebuild the entire set from Episode 1, the scene was filmed on blue screen, matching the camera angles from the previous movie and reusing old footage for the background. But this presents a problem. In Episode 2, Yoda's the digital character, but the archival footage from Episode 1 still has Yaddle as a puppet, which presents an incongruity. And while she would only appear in one shot in this movie if she was left in, keeping her on the council would either mean having to build a digital Yaddle for Episode 3, or let her stay a puppet and keep the incongruity throughout the trilogy. So it's better in the long run to replace her with someone else. Enter Shaak Ti. The other new member of the Jedi Council in Episode 2 is Coleman Trebor, who also exists as a replacement for an Episode 1 character. This time as a replacement for the long-necked Yarael Poof, whose design was probably too distractingly similar to the Kaminoans who appear later in the movie. Unlike Shaak Ti though, Coleman's design didn't come from a striking unused Sith Lord. Instead, it was actually an unused head sculpt for the new alien character Dexter Jetster. To help with the design process for Dexter, artist Mike Murnane sculpted a bunch of different maquettes to help George Lucas figure out what sort of face the character would have. And after getting input from the animation and VFX supervisors who would be in charge of actually bringing the character to life, Lucas combined elements from 2 maquettes to get a character with the Ernest Borgnine personality he was looking for. Dexter Jettster also leads us to the next major alien species introduced in the movie, the mysterious denizens of Kamino. These creatures are another one of those surprisingly old Star Wars ideas, going all the way back to The Empire Strikes Back, where a secretive race of tall, pale aliens were going to be the native inhabitants of Bespin. When the idea was brought back for Attack of the Clones, Lucas thought that maybe the Kaminoans could be the aliens seen at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, though as the design evolved further to include seal-like elements to help them fit into their aquatic environment, that idea was abandoned. As a new major species for the movie, several different artists had a hand in creating the Kaminoans, with one unused idea by Doug Chiang eventually reappearing as Episode 3's mysterious Polis Massons. As a counterpoint to the Kaminoans, we have the Geonosians. Like the cloners, the droid builders are also a reference to an earlier Star Wars idea, this time the early Nemoidian design that resembled the battle droids. With the droid factory actually being shown in this movie, it made sense to use those early Nemoidians as a starting point for the Geonosians. Their story role as a society of builders helped to inform their habitat as well, with their buildings being designed to resemble termite mounds mixed with Gothic cathedrals. The Geonosians aren't the only aliens on Geonosis though. Dooku's separatist cabal includes a few new alien creatures as well, including the robotic Wat Tambor, who originates as an unused Dexter Jettster head and whose body was fleshed out by sculptor Mike Murnane. Tambor's peers Shumai and Sandhill don't have designs that come from extra Jetsters, and instead they have unique designs from artist Dermot Power. As speaking characters, it's important to set them apart from each other and make it clear to the audience that Dooku is making an alliance with several different groups rather than a single large organization like the Trade Federation in Episode 1. Palpatine also has a new entourage in Attack of the Clones, with Chancellor Valorum's human aide from Episode 1 being replaced with the Umbaran Sly Moore, designed by Dermot Power. In this movie, George Lucas wanted to start bringing in some hints of Palpatine's true evil nature, which included giving him a slightly sinister posse to go along with his Red Office and guards. And as a contrast to Palpatine, Episode 3's Utapounds look unpleasant but are actually good guys. And if you think that their look doesn't exactly fit their environment, you'd be right. They were originally designed by artist Sang Jun Lee to be the denizens of Mustafar, which is where the ashy gray skin and red robes come from. The original inhabitants of Utapau were to be a race of lemur-like aliens who eventually appeared in the Clone Wars cartoon. The change may have been a cost-cutting measure. Since the residents of Utapau don't actually appear very much in the movie, creating a race of CGI lemur people may not have been worth it. And that brings us to the end of the prequels. At least according to the collage. There's some glaring omissions from the image, including the arena monsters, General Grievous, many of the pod racers, the entire ecosystem of Naboo, but that just speaks to how much work was done to populate the version of the Star Wars galaxy depicted in those movies. And we've still got a whole trilogy to cover. Almost. There's actually one alien from Return of the Jedi included in the sequel section of the collage, Wart, the alien frog that lives outside Jabba's palace. Another Wart does appear in The Force Awakens, though he's hidden inside a cage being carried around by a different alien on Jakku. The only way you'd know he was in the movie at all is if you read the visual dictionary, or go to Wikipedia. And that's probably how this whole image was compiled in the first place, by looking at Wikipedia's list of aliens and creatures that appear in the sequels and cherry-picking the ones that share a particular aesthetic, regardless of whether a design was actually visible in the movie or was even created for the sequels at all. And what that says to me is that the line between a Disney-era design and a Lucas-era design isn't as sharp as it may seem at first, that not all designs from the older movies are amazing, and that there might be some from the newer movies that are. With that in mind, let's take a look at the first new alien species we're introduced to in Episode 7, the Abednego, 2 of which are included in the collage image. This new species was created by creature designer Jake Lunt Davies, who noticed that the original trilogy tended to be very human-centric outside of the creature feature scenes, so he came up with an alien design he liked and tried to get it in as many places in the movie as he could. Since they're not designed for any particular setting or role, it means that their design is a bit generic, but it can also be adapted to fit a wide variety of character types, from the hulking cybernetic Rudown to the aged Senator Brass Monkey or the hotshot pilot Elo Asti. Another new alien species that's included twice in the collage is the Tarsunt. Like the Abednego, these guys were designed by Jake Lunt Davies, and they share some of the same design cues, like wide-set eyes and nostrils that taper down to a narrow mouth with some dangly bits on the side. They do have a unique posture though, since one of the things the creature designers on the sequels tried to do as much as possible was disguise the shape of the human performers. One alien who does this pretty well is Baba Joe, the guy who carries Wart in a cage on Jakku, and who actually debuted in an early promotional video well ahead of the movie itself. With this alien, Davies hid the performer inside the tower of animal cages slung on his back. Another denizen of Jakku is the Krolute Unkar Plutt. The idea for this character actually came from director J.J. Abrams' daughter, who suggested putting an alien based on a blobfish in the movie. The early look for the character by artist Ivan Manzella was designed as an animatronic that would be worn by a performer in a suit, so his features were initially more spread out and exaggerated. When Simon Pegg was cast in the role, Abrams decided he wanted to switch to a makeup and prosthetics approach for the character, in order to be able to keep as much of Pegg's acting as possible. Ultimately though, the mask didn't make it into the movie, and Plutt's face was instead replaced with a CGI render based on Pegg's performance, which allowed ILM to exaggerate his features a bit more, though not as much as in the original design. Another new alien character is everyone's favorite grave-robbing Union buster Maz Kanata. Early in the movie's development, there was a call to design a new Yoda, a character who would impart wisdom about the Force to the movie's protagonist. The earliest drawings took this literally, making characters of the same species as Yoda, some of which used old Ralph McQuarrie art as a base, and some that were designed to look like McQuarrie himself. Eventually, the idea of doing literally a new Yoda was discarded, and the art department was instead told to model the character on Rose Gilbert, a high school teacher that J.J. Abrams and production designer Rick Carter had both been students of. Gilbert's large glasses became a focal point for the character, with some designs trying to incorporate the feel of them without actually giving her physical goggles. And even though the character had this specific starting point, it still took a while to finalize her look. The production had intended for Maz to be a puppet or animatronic, but without an approved design being ready in time for filming, the decision was made to transform her into a computer-generated character instead, giving the team more time to work on the design. But sometimes, working on something for too long can be harmful for it. Either you spend so long tinkering with the details and sanding down all the rough edges that you end up with something generic and lacking a vital creative spark, or you never find that spark to begin with and just have to throw your hands up at some point and say, good enough. And maybe one of those two things happened with Maz. After all, the character started out as New Yoda, which is a creative endeavor that's about as likely to succeed as New Coke. Maz's castle also serves as this movie's version of the Cantina or Jabba's palace, and many of the creatures within were designed with the classic aliens from those other scenes in mind. One of the more egregious examples is the Atigan Praster Omlin, who was given the nickname The Priest during development and is clearly inspired by A New Hope's Ithorian. Inside the castle, we also catch a glimpse of Maz's chef, Cookie. After seeing the initial concept art for the character's face by Ivan Manzella, J.J. Abrams thought that the character looked a bit like Quasimodo, so further iterations of the character were pushed more in that direction, giving him a humpback and more deformed facial features. Also inside the castle is a little guy called Prue Suivant. Like Cookie, Prue had a specific design inspiration, though in this case the character's face was designed by Ivan Manzella to be a mask worn by a specific performer, Kieran Shaw, who also played the scavenger Tito earlier in the movie and appeared in Return of the Jedi as both an Ewok and the Gonk droid being tortured in Jabba's dungeon. Another character designed for a specific actor was Wolavan, who was played by Star Wars mainstay Warwick Davis and designed by Ivan Manzella and Jake Lunt Davies. The idea behind Wolavan was that he would probably be quite a pushover, but would have an enormous alien dog next to him for protection. While both Wolavan and the dog made it into the movie, they weren't paired up, so Wolavan now exists by himself as just this weird alien millhouse. There were also some new hand puppet characters featured in the castle, like the Bravasians, designed by Jake Lunt Davies. Referred to as snooty pirates on set, their goggles and long noses kind of make me think they might have been inspired by Gurinden, who himself was known as Long Snoot before being given a proper name. Another long-nosed alien is Gwellis Bagnoro, dubbed Ellaman in concept art by Luke Fisher. Based on the production nickname and his trunk, we can probably assume that he was inspired by elephants. One of the more massive patrons of Maz's castle is Grumgar the Dewootin. This Big Daddy Dodongo is paired with the petite First Order spy, Bazine Natal, and he carries a lot of character in his posture, costume, and sheer size, which is actually kind of improbable if you think about it. He's way too big to fit in the door, so how did he get in there? Is there like a loading bay or something? Anyway, design-wise, Grumgar's face was first created by Ivan Manzella, as many of these aliens were, with Jake Lunt Davies filling out his body and costume, taking particular inspiration from the bounty hunter Bosk. One of the more featured creatures in the castle is the space pirate Quiggled. who was initially illustrated by Luke Fisher and then finalized by Jake Lunt Davies. Like some of the creatures in Return of the Jedi and Attack of the Clones, Quiggled was pulled from the pool of castle alien designs to have a more prominent role in the sequence. Despite Quiggled being more prominent though, he's definitely the sort of creature that blends into the background, especially compared to his more striking captain. And that might be due to him essentially being a promoted extra. The creatures and characters in Maz's castle are largely made up of warm yellow and brown tones with a bit of blue for contrast, which makes sense if you're designing a background ensemble. You want to be able to keep the focus on the actual characters in the scene, even if there's a bunch of wild creatures running around in the background. Jabba's palace did something similar, with most of the aliens being pale yellow or orange with a bit of green here and there, and a couple featured characters popping with blue. Mos Eisley Cantina kind of got to have its cake and eat it too in this regard, thanks to the way the sequence was filmed. The more generic on-set characters fell into the warm, sandy palette of the bar and largely blended into the background, while all the memorable creatures were filmed separately months later, meaning that there was no danger of a hammerhead walking by in the background and taking the focus away from the story. The next movie, The Last Jedi, takes us away from scum and villainy into the galactic high society of Canto Bight. Among the creatures to appear in the casino are a trio of smiling Sweartons, who represent a noteworthy change from the aliens of the other trilogies. Many aliens in the newer movies that are brought to life by pullover masks are sculpted with a specific expression on their face to give them more character, while the older movies used masks that are more neutral. While this does allow each character to fit the setting they're designed for more specifically, it also limits where they can be used. So while it might make sense for a couple of aliens to be laughing while enjoying a game together, their expressions would be inappropriate if mixed in with the crowd of onlookers who see the destruction of the Hosnian system. And this ultimately prevents the audience from becoming familiar with some of the new designs in the same way they did with the older ones, because the ones we see getting reused from show to show are the ones that have those contextless neutral faces, or characters with animatronic faces in the case of Rigfu Wirkola, who ended up reappearing in The Mandalorian. This guy is also a creature seemingly designed to hide the operators within. With a hulking frame and a head in the center of his chest, he feels a bit like an alien version of the Kingpin from Into the Spider-Verse. Gatha Elbafe slightly resembles our buddy Rigfu in that she's a small face sitting in the middle of a big humpback body, though she's quite a bit smoother. She was designed by Luke Fisher, and Elbafe's name is derived from her production nickname of Ms. Elbowface. Defancio Storsilt is another alien seen in the casino, and he was designed by Jake Lunt Davies to be portrayed by performer Derek Campbell, who is a double below-the-knee amputee. The character's long, lithe body is topped with a head resembling a dog, which, along with the spurs he wears in his concept art, suggests the idea of a greyhound who is himself a jockey. Unfortunately, despite this pretty clever design, we never get a good look at the character's full body in the movie, so that physicality is kind of wasted on screen. And our last Canto Bight alien, Sosir Lada, is a creature who doesn't have any information about who designed him or what the artist was intending to capture with this creation. He does have a few hallmarks of Jake Lunt Davies' work though, particularly the wide-set eyes and tapered face structure that also appears on the Tarsund and Abednego aliens. And far away from Canto Bight, we meet a new species of alien caretakers who maintain the ancient Jedi temple on their homeworld. The idea for these creatures, the Lanai, was that they would be genetically related to their neighbors, the Porgs, in some way. To differentiate them from the Porgs, though, the Lanai were given more aquatic features, making them slightly fish-like. The approved design for the creatures was created by Jake Lunt Davies, with Chris Weston doing work to flesh out their personality and culture. And that brings us to the end of the collage, and I think now we've got a good grasp of what distinguishes the creature designs from each trilogy and why someone might prefer one group over another. On the original trilogy, the creature designs sometimes came from the script, but often were just a result of the sculptors and illustrators taking inspiration from wherever they could, whether it's old sci-fi movies and alien lore, real-life animals, or just playing with clay until they got something cool. And when there were alien characters who weren't just there to fill out the frame, their designs came from who they were as people. Chewbacca was a loyal companion, Yoda showed that strength can come from unexpected places, and Jabba looked exactly as disgusting as his personality. In the prequels, we started to see aliens as true inhabitants of the galaxy. The environments and societies these creatures lived in shaped their designs, and even individuals seen far from their homes were created to fit the community they had become a part of, whether they're diminutive, multi-limbed pod racers, powerful and noble Jedi, or weak and shrunken capitalists. The prequels also had more aliens that were actual characters this time around, even in very minor roles, which meant designing aliens that could quickly form an emotional connection with the audience. And while there were still a few stone-faced pullover mask aliens, a lot of creatures had complex animatronics to help them deliver dialogue, were shaped directly onto an actor's face, or had digital faces that didn't rely on a performer to try and emote through a rubber mask. With the newer movies, we see things collapsing a bit. Rather than designing aliens to fit their habitat or draw from obscure personal interests, the primary inspiration was just Star Wars. When they were designing aliens for the new movies, the artists often asked themselves whether their design would fit into the Mos Eisley Cantina or Jabba's palace, a question that none of the artists on the original trilogy asked themselves because back then the only barometer for a Star Wars alien was that it was in a Star Wars movie. And as for why that specific sequel trilogy alien look seems to be so common, I think we might have an answer. We've seen that a lot of the newer aliens were designed in ways that could somehow disguise a human performer. Some can be pretty creative, but when you need to fill out a crowd scene, you can't make every character a unique feat of engineering. Most are going to be people in masks. So instead, you play with the features of the face to make it not so humanoid. But you also need to make sure the performer can see what they're doing, so you need to put eye holes somewhere, and often that ends up being the nostrils. So the nostrils become the central point of the face, with the eyes and mouth being rearranged around them. And because there's only so many places to put those things and still have it look like a face, you end up with some designs that stick out as being very similar. But the fact that those crowd-filling pullover mask aliens are the most prominent part of modern Star Wars creature design is also a sign that the newer movies are kind of bereft of actual alien characters. There's Maz, but again, she was explicitly designed to be a replacement for something that already existed. Unkar Plutt, he's smooth Jabba with legs, and I guess you could call Supreme Leader Snoke an alien, maybe in like the first two movies, but he's just a palette swap Palpatine with the scale slider cranked up. The only real new alien character that isn't a retread of something from an older movie is Babu Frick, whose species, the Anzellans, went on to have an encore in The Mandalorian because it turns out, when you do something new, people actually like it. And the same goes for the creatures. The Rathtars were just a new version of the Dianoga and the Trash Compactor, but the Porgs have no precedent in Star Wars. And stuff like that is what this collage is leaving out. All the alien and creature designs from across the saga that don't support the narrative of modern Star Wars being uniformly terrible compared to what came before. So let's take a look at those designs. Some designs from the older movies that maybe aren't as successful, as well as a few newer aliens and creatures that I think work really well. First, we'll go back to the Cantina. I've mentioned before that George Lucas wasn't satisfied with what was filmed the first time around, and when you look at the lineup of creatures that were actually on set, yeah, there's definitely some classics in there. Greedo, the bat-faced Cabe, the artist eventually known as Bosk, but look at the rest of these guys. It's just beige mammals with glassy black eyes and stretched out faces. The Lutrillians haven't even gotten an action figure, and they made an action figure of everyone. They made an action figure of Constable Zuvio, and he's not even in the movie. But even after doing the reshoots, George Lucas still thought that some of the creatures in the Cantina were a bit lacking. Among the changes to the Star Wars Special Edition was the replacement of 2 of Rick Baker's Wolfman creatures with new aliens. And weirdly enough, those 4 different aliens only used 2 different masks. The werewolves, you could probably guess, one is an off-the-shelf Halloween mask that Baker had created, while the other was the same mask, just modified to be a bit more alien. But the new guys share the same face too, with the reptilian Melis just being the back of the elephant-like Ketwal's head. Jabba's skiff guards in Return of the Jedi are also really samey, being these greenish, brownish, leathery, dried-out guys with vaguely humanoid faces. A couple of these aliens are so similar to each other that the expanded universe even made them different races of the same species. I think that part of this similarity comes from them being characters that are involved in a major action sequence, which means that they're going to be played by stuntmen who need to be able to see what they're doing while doing a very physical performance, which means you can't play around with the facial features or proportions the way you could with some of the other creatures who just need to stand around. Moving on to the prequels, the big alien exhibition scene in Episode 1 was the pod race, and the racers themselves are great. But there's a featured design among the spectators that maybe isn't as unique as it could be. Aura Singh isn't that bad on her own, but she represents a trend in the prequels of just making aliens that are human beings with different color skin and maybe a prosthetic or two. This kinda dates back to the Twi'leks in the original trilogy, but the prequels ran wild with it. Humans but green, humans but blue, humans with horns, humans with tentacles, humans with horns and tentacles, humans with different horns and tentacles. I think what makes us more willing to forgive these sorts of fallback techniques for groups like Jabba Skiff Guards or the prequel humanoids is that they're close enough to human that their similarities don't jump out as odd. We see human faces every day, so seeing a bunch of aliens with more or less human facial proportions doesn't activate our brains in the same way seeing a bunch of non-human faces arranged in a particular way does. So let's take a look at them again, this time looking for interesting creature design, and we can use what we've learned about the successful creatures in the older movies to help guide us. We're looking for designs that tell us something about the character, either about their personality or their role in the story. We're looking for designs that feel like they belong in a living universe, like there's a logic to why they live in a specific place or belong to a specific group. We're looking for designs that are iconic, characters and creatures that may be in the background but draw our attention or feel like they could play a major role in another story. We're looking for designs that are unique, that are unlikely to be confused or conflated with another creature. And finally, we're looking for designs that don't just take inspiration from other Star Wars movies. One creature from The Force Awakens that I like is the Lugabeast. Its design effectively communicates what it is, some sort of cybernetic beast of burden. Its worn-down look fits well with the scrapyard aesthetic of Jakku, and you're unlikely to get it mixed up with a dewback or a tauntaun. And while it definitely feels inspired by other Star Wars creatures, it's basically what you might expect a Jawa's bantha to look like, the origin of the Lugabeast actually came from the stage adaptation of Warhorse, which one of the movie's puppeteers had worked on, leading to the Star Wars crew trying to create a creature based on the same puppeteering technology. Once we get to Maz's castle, the standout design has to be the Crimson Corsair, Ciudadano Thano. His cape and cowboy hat silhouette make him feel like a rugged gunslinger, and he seems right at home in Maz's Pirate Haven castle, even if it seems unlikely that he'll be drinking anything. His design is definitely iconic, and he feels cool and mysterious without obviously trying to be something like the next Boba Fett. The next movie to be released after Episode 7 was Rogue One, which was left off of the original collage for some reason. And while the movie definitely introduces a bunch of new creatures, most of them are still too clearly trying to fit into that leathery Tatooine aesthetic. And without a showcase scene like Maz's castle, most of the aliens we encounter are members of the Rebellion, and there's one design in particular that is the best of the bunch. The twin Tognaths, Benthic and Edrio, are striking members of Saw Gerrera's partisans. The first time we see one is when Imperial defector Bodhi Rook is being taken to meet Saw, and the eerie skull-faced Benthic makes both Bodhi and the audience question whether or not he's going to survive the encounter. These guys make sense as members of Saw's more radical rebel group, and they become staple members of his crew, reappearing in places like Rebels and Andor, and while they share some basic similarities with characters like Zuckuss or Plo Koon, their skeletal aesthetic definitely sets them apart from those guys, and those characters don't serve as direct inspiration. Instead, the look of the Tognaths was based on the gas masks used in the first two World Wars, which makes sense since Rogue One shows the galaxy through the lens of a war movie. After Rogue One is The Last Jedi, and while it definitely has its fair share of generic Star Wars aliens, it also has a few really great new designs as well. The first ones we see are the Porgs, which I already mentioned, and they absolutely meet all the criteria we've laid out. First, they're not based on anything in Star Wars, instead they exist to solve a real-world problem. Skellig Michael, the location where Luke's island retreat was filmed, is a puffin nesting site. So rather than digitally remove the creatures from the footage, the filmmakers decided to incorporate them into the movie, creating the Porgs to act as the Star Wars version of the animals. This means that, by necessity, they're designed to belong in a specific environment, and their design has to be suitably puffin-like so that the real ones don't clash too much with the puppets. This also makes their design pretty unique among Star Wars creatures, which usually trend more towards being bizarre and monstrous. And of course their iconic Porg merchandise was everywhere when the movie came out, and unlike Jar Jar's tongue lollipop, people actually bought it. There is one more creature from The Last Jedi that deserves a mention, the Vulptuses of Crate. Their elegant, crystalline design makes sense for a creature that lives on a mineral planet, and it's also got enough of a mystical quality to it that their narrative role in helping the Resistance escape also makes sense. Their design is iconic enough to be featured in the movie's trailer alongside the Porgs, and they're definitely not going to be confused with any other creature in the Star Wars universe. Next up is Solo, which probably has the laziest alien design in the entire series with Dryden Voss, but also it has a few that are pretty good. The first of the interesting designs is the alien gangster Lady Proxima. During the initial development of the movie, the underworld faction Han works for on Corellia was going to be a group of vampiric albino aliens whose gang was named after the Bram Stoker novel Lair of the White Worm. When Phil Lord and Chris Miller briefly came on board the movie, they decided to go more literal with the name and made the leader of the White Worms an enormous serpent. And while making her a literal worm does echo Jabba the Hutt down the line, it seems like that was more of a coincidence than intentional inspiration, and you're not likely to get the two confused. She also definitely feels like she belongs in that sewer, which is an interestingly literal take on the concept of an underworld. From Proxima, we can take a look at another new female character, Dryden Voss's attendant Margot. Her design fits in well with the environment of Dryden's ship. She's elegant, kind of prequel-like, but her cracked face suggests that the beauty aboard the First Light is hiding something corrupt. And like some of the more striking prequel Jedi, Margot's design was originally intended to have a lot more screen time, since she was a potential design for Kira back when the filmmakers were considering making her an alien. After Solo comes The Rise of Skywalker, and with it some great new creatures, but while the movie definitely stepped up the diversity of aliens across the board, there's only one that really hits everything I think we need for a great Star Wars creature design, and that, of course, is Claude. And weirdly, what makes Claude work is that he doesn't. The character was created to be comically out of place as a crew member on the Millennium Falcon, and the design pulls that off beautifully. With no arms, stubby little feet, and a flared base, there's nothing about this guy that makes any sense as a creature that would even survive long enough to get into space. And that design philosophy of going against the usual Star Wars creature design rules makes him stand out from the crowd in ways that other, more conventionally interesting aliens don't. To me, Claude is representative of the best possible future for Star Wars, one that does what it wants and doesn't take the franchise too seriously, but is still invested enough to know the rules that it's breaking. It's too bad he's a homophobe.